The floodwater rose around the trapped family like liquid darkness. But Nurse Priya Sethi wasn't about to let them drown. She had delivered babies before, just never on a rooftop during the worst flood in decades. As she guided the newborn into the world with nothing but emergency supplies and sheer determination, she had no idea the infant's first cries would echo across continents. She didn't know the parents weren't ordinary people. She didn't know that within hours, the most powerful humanitarian organization in the world would be searching for the mysterious nurse who saved their hair. But as dawn broke the next morning, and the sound of helicopter blades filled the air above her modest home, one question remained. Could a single act of compassion in rising waters change not just one life, but thousands? Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Priya Sethi had always believed that storms brought out either the best or worst in people, never something in between. As she drove her battered Honda through the increasingly flooded streets of Riverside Township that Tuesday evening, she watched both extremes play out through her rain-streaked windshield. Some neighbors were loading sandbags with methodical determination, while others stood on their porches arguing about evacuation routes that no longer existed. The radio crackled with emergency warnings that seemed to grow more urgent by the hour, but Priya had heard it all before during her 15 years as a registered nurse at Mercy General Hospital. What she hadn't expected was the emergency dispatch that came through her volunteer radio just as she was turning onto Maple Street. All available medical personnel, we have a pregnant woman in active labor trapped on Riverside Avenue. Emergency vehicles cannot reach the location due to flooding. Repeat, woman in active labor. Immediate assistance required. Priya's hands tightened on the steering wheel as she made a sharp U-turn, her training overriding every instinct that told her to head home to safety. The scene she arrived at would stay with her forever. Water had risen to nearly 4 feet in some areas, transforming the familiar neighborhood into an alien landscape of submerged cars and floating debris. She could see them immediately, a cluster of people on the roof of the 2-story colonial house, their desperate waves visible even through the driving rain. Priya parked her car on the highest ground she could find and grabbed her emergency medical kit from the trunk, the same one she'd carried during her volunteer work in rural clinics. The journey to reach them required every ounce of her physical strength and mental determination. She waded through chest-deep water that moved with deceptive swiftness, using submerged fences and car roofs as stepping stones. Her scrubs clung to her body like a second skin, and more than once, she nearly lost her footing as hidden debris caught her legs. The family's voices grew clearer as she approached, a mixture of panic and relief that cut through the storm's constant roar. "Thank God you're here," called out a man who appeared to be in his early 30s, his expensive clothing now soaked and mud-stained. He helped pull Priya onto the sloped roof, where she immediately assessed the situation. The pregnant woman lay on a makeshift bed of coats and blankets, her face contorted with pain as another contraction gripped her. Priya's trained eye took in everything at once, the woman's breathing pattern, the frequency of contractions, the way her husband hovered protectively nearby despite his obvious fear. "I'm Priya. I'm a registered nurse," she announced, dropping to her knees beside the laboring woman. "What's your name, sweetheart?" The woman managed to gasp out, "Elena," between contractions, and Priya immediately began her examination. What she discovered made her heart race. This baby was coming, whether they were ready or not. Elena was fully dilated, and the infant's head was already crowning. There would be no time to wait for professional rescue teams or proper medical facilities. "We're going to do this right here," Priya told them, with a confidence she didn't entirely feel. She had delivered babies in hospital settings countless times, but never in conditions like these. The roof was slippery with rain. Her supplies were limited to what she carried in her emergency kit, and the sounds of the storm made communication difficult. Yet something inside her clicked into place, the same calm focus that had carried her through medical emergencies before. Elena's husband, whom she learned was named David, proved to be an invaluable assistant despite having no medical training. He followed Priya's instructions without question, helping to position Elena and providing emotional support when the pain became overwhelming. There was something about the couple that struck Priya as unusual, a composure and grace that seemed out of place given their circumstances. but she pushed the observation aside to focus on the task at hand. The baby arrived during the storm's fiercest hour, when lightning illuminated the flooded landscape like a strobe light, and thunder shook the very foundations of the house beneath them. Priya caught the tiny, slippery form with hands that had delivered dozens of babies, but never under circumstances that felt quite so miraculous. The infant's first cry pierced through the storm's cacophony, a sound so pure and strong that everyone on the roof fell silent for a moment, awed by the power of new life entering the world against all odds. "It's a girl," Priya announced, quickly clearing the baby's airways and checking her vital signs. Everything appeared normal, perfect even, despite the chaotic circumstances of her birth. She wrapped the infant in the cleanest blankets available and placed her in Elena's waiting arms. The look of pure joy and relief on the new mother's face was something Priya would remember for the rest of her life, a moment of transcendent beauty amid the chaos of the storm. The afterbirth followed without complications, and Priya worked efficiently to ensure Elena's bleeding was under control and that both mother and baby were stable. She used her limited supplies to clean and dress Elena, all while keeping a watchful eye on the infant's breathing and color. David had produced a waterproof bag from somewhere, which he used to protect important documents, though Priya was too focused on her patients to pay much attention to what he was safeguarding. As the storm began to subside in the early hours of Wednesday morning, rescue boats finally arrived to evacuate the family from the roof. In the chaos of the rescue operation, with multiple emergency responders shouting instructions and the complexity of safely transferring a newborn and recovering mother, Priya found herself separated from the Fromber family she had helped bring together. She watched their boat disappear into the misty dawn, carrying the people whose names she had learned in fragments during the most intense hours of their lives together. The exhaustion hit her like a physical blow as she finally made her way back to her own car. Her clothes were soaked through, her medical kit was depleted, and every muscle in her body ached from the night's exertions. But underneath the physical fatigue was something else, a deep satisfaction that came from knowing she had made a difference when it mattered most. She had helped bring a new life into the world under impossible circumstances, and both mother and baby were healthy and safe. Priya drove home through streets that were slowly beginning to drain as the storm moved on, leaving behind the kind of devastation that would take months to fully repair. Her small house on Pine Street had suffered minor flooding in the basement, but the main living areas were untouched. She peeled off her wet clothes, took the longest hot shower of her life, and fell into bed just as the sun was beginning to rise over the damaged landscape. She slept deeply, the kind of exhausted sleep that comes after physical and emotional extremes, and dreamed of tiny hands and first cries echoing across dark water. When she woke, it was to a sound she had never heard in her quiet neighborhood before, the steady thrum of helicopter rotors growing closer and closer to her house. Priya stumbled to her bedroom window, still groggy from sleep, and felt her breath catch in her throat at what she saw. A sleek, white helicopter was descending toward her front yard, its rotors creating a windstorm that bent the recovering trees and scattered debris across her neighbors' lawns. The aircraft bore no obvious markings except for a small, elegant logo that she couldn't quite make out from her window. As it touched down on her modest patch of grass, Priya's mind raced through possibilities. Had something happened to the family she'd helped the night before? Was there some kind of emergency that required her immediate assistance? She threw on the first clothes she could find and hurried downstairs, her heart pounding with a mixture of curiosity and concern. Through her front window, she watched as the helicopter's doors opened and several figures emerged. The first was David, the man who had helped her deliver his daughter just hours before, but he looked completely different now. Gone were the mud-stained clothes and desperate expression of the night before. Instead, he wore an expensive suit that somehow remained perfectly pressed, despite his recent ordeal, and he carried himself with the kind of confidence that suggested he was accustomed to having helicopters at his disposal. Behind him came Elena, and Priya's professional eye immediately noted that she looked remarkably well for someone who had given birth on a rooftop less than 12 hours earlier. She carried the baby in a carrier that looked like it cost more than Priya's monthly salary, and her posture suggested access to the kind of immediate postpartum care that most new mothers could only dream of. Following them were two other individuals, a woman in an elegant business suit who carried herself with obvious authority, and a man who had the alert, watchful demeanor of professional security. Priya opened her front door just as David reached her porch steps, and the smile that spread across his face was genuine and warm despite the surreal circumstances. "Priya," he said, extending his hand, "I hope you don't mind the dramatic arrival. We needed to find you, and we needed to find you quickly. There are some things we need to discuss that couldn't wait for normal channels." She invited them in, her mind still struggling to process the transformation from the desperate family she had helped to these obviously wealthy and influential people standing in her modest living room. Elena settled into Priya's worn armchair with the baby, and when she looked up, her eyes held the same gratitude that had shone through the storm the night before, but also something else. A kind of purposeful intensity that made Priya suddenly aware that this visit was about much more than a simple thank you. The woman in the business suit introduced herself as Margaret Chen, and when she handed Priya her business card, the title made Priya's eyes widen in surprise. Margaret was the Director of Operations for the International Humanitarian Relief Foundation, one of the largest and most respected charitable organizations in the world. Priya had seen their work featured in documentaries and news reports about disaster relief efforts in dozens of countries, but she had never imagined having any personal connection to such a massive organization. "Ms. Sethi," Margaret began, settling into the chair across from Priya. "What you did last night was extraordinary, but it was also just the latest example of something we've been tracking about you for quite some time. Your volunteer work at rural clinics, your response to emergency calls during natural disasters, your consistent pattern of providing medical care to underserved communities, it all adds up to exactly the kind of person we've been searching for." Elena spoke up from her chair, her voice still carrying the slight hoarseness that often followed childbirth, but filled with unmistakable conviction. "David and I aren't just grateful parents, Priya. We're also the founding directors of the Riverside Foundation, which is the primary funding source for IHOF field operations. We've spent years looking for healthcare professionals who have both the technical skills and the personal courage to work in the most challenging environments imaginable." The pieces began to fall into place in Priya's mind. The expensive clothes, the private helicopter, the way they had handled the crisis on the roof with such composure despite the obvious danger. All of it made sense now. She was looking at people who were accustomed to operating under pressure, who had resources most people couldn't imagine, and who had apparently decided that her actions during the flood had qualified her for something she didn't yet understand. David leaned forward in his chair, his expression becoming more serious. "What we're about to offer you will sound impossible, and we want you to know that you can take time to think about it. But we also want you to understand that lives are hanging in the balance, and every day we delay means more people suffer needlessly." End quote. He paused, looking at his wife, who nodded encouragingly. "We want you to lead a mobile medical unit in South Sudan, providing emergency health care to refugee populations that no other organization has been able to reach." The magnitude of what he was proposing hit Priya like a physical force. South Sudan was one of the most dangerous places on earth for humanitarian workers, a country torn apart by civil war and facing one of the worst humanitarian crises in recent history. The idea that she, a small-town nurse from a modest background, could lead medical operations in such a place seemed almost absurd. Yet as she looked around her living room at these powerful, influential people who had tracked her down because of her actions during a local emergency, she realized they were completely serious. Margaret pulled out a tablet and began showing Priya photographs and statistics that painted a devastating picture of human suffering. Refugee camps with tens of thousands of people and only one doctor, children dying from easily preventable diseases, women giving birth without any medical assistance at all. "The traditional approach isn't working," Margaret explained. "Large, permanent medical facilities are targets for violence, and they can't reach the most vulnerable populations. What we need is exactly what you demonstrated last night. The ability to provide excellent medical care under impossible conditions, to adapt and improvise, and never give up." End quote. Elena adjusted the baby in her arms and looked directly at Priya. "This little girl exists because you are willing to wade through floodwater to help strangers. There are thousands of children in South Sudan who could have the same chance at life if someone with your skills and courage was there to help them. We're not asking you to be a hero. We're asking you to be exactly what you already are, a nurse who refuses to let circumstances prevent her from saving lives." End quote. The room fell silent as Priya processed what she was hearing. The logical part of her mind immediately began generating objections and concerns. She had never worked internationally. She didn't speak any African languages. She had never operated in a war zone, and the risks involved were unlike anything she had ever faced. But another part of her, the same part that had driven her to respond to emergency calls for 15 years, was already imagining the faces of the people she could help. "What exactly would this involve?" she asked, surprised by how steady her voice sounded despite the turmoil in her thoughts. David and Margaret exchanged a look before Margaret began outlining a proposal that was both terrifying and inspiring. Priya would undergo 3 months of intensive training in emergency medicine, tropical diseases, security protocols, and cultural awareness. She would then deploy to South Sudan with a team of specially trained medics and security personnel, operating mobile clinics that could reach refugee populations in remote and dangerous areas. The financial package they described was more money than Priya had ever imagined earning, enough to pay off her modest mortgage, support her aging parents, and still have substantial savings for the future. But more than the money, they were offering her something she hadn't even realized she was searching for: the chance to use her skills on a scale that could genuinely change the world. "The training would begin next month," David explained. "We maintain a facility in Virginia where we prepare all our field personnel for deployment in high-risk environments. You'd learn everything from advanced trauma surgery to negotiating with armed militias to purifying water in the field. By the time you deployed, you'd be as prepared as anyone could be for the challenges you'd face." Elena spoke again, her voice soft but compelling. "I know it sounds overwhelming, and it is. But so was delivering a baby on a rooftop in the middle of a flood. And you made that look routine. We've researched your background, Priya, your performance evaluations, your volunteer work, the testimonials from patients and colleagues. Everything points to someone who thrives when the stakes are highest." Priya found herself thinking about the moment when she had caught Elena's newborn daughter in her hands, the incredible rush of bringing life into the world against all odds. Could she experience that same sense of purpose and accomplishment on a larger scale, helping not just one family but entire communities? The idea was both exhilarating and terrifying, a chance to push herself far beyond anything she had ever attempted. "What happened to the last person who had this job?" she asked, and the slight pause before Margaret answered told her more than she wanted to know. "Dr. Rebecca Martinez was evacuated 6 months ago after her convoy was attacked. She survived, but she needed extensive medical treatment and psychological support. She's recovered now, but she made the decision not to return to field work." The honesty was both refreshing and sobering. These people weren't trying to minimize the risks or paint an unrealistic picture of what she would be facing. They were acknowledging that the work was dangerous, that people got hurt, and that the psychological toll could be as challenging as the physical dangers. Yet they were still asking her to consider it because they believed the potential impact was worth the risks. David stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the helicopter that waited in Priya's front yard like something from a movie. "I want to tell you something that we don't usually share with potential recruits," he said. "Elena and I lost our first child in a refugee camp in Syria 5 years ago. We were there doing documentary work, trying to raise awareness about the humanitarian crisis, when Elena went into premature labor." His voice became quiet, filled with old pain that hadn't entirely healed. There was a medical facility in the camp, but it was understaffed and under-equipped. The doctor was overwhelmed, the nurse had been working for 36 hours straight, and there simply weren't resources to handle complications. "Our son lived for 3 hours." Elena's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded for him to continue. "That experience changed everything for us. We realized that documentation and awareness campaigns weren't enough. People were dying not because solutions didn't exist, but because skilled, committed medical professionals weren't available when and where they were needed most. We decided to dedicate our lives and our resources to changing that, one healthcare provider at a time." The baby in Elena's arms made a small sound, and the contrast between her current situation and the tragedy they had described was almost overwhelming. This child had been born into safety and privilege, attended by a skilled nurse who had risked her own well-being to ensure her safe arrival. How many children in refugee camps would never have that same chance? Margaret opened her tablet again and showed Priya a map of South Sudan marked with red dots representing refugee concentrations. There are over 4 million displaced people in the country right now, she said. Most of them have no access to health care beyond basic first aid provided by volunteers with minimal training. Maternal mortality rates are among the highest in the world, and children die every day from diseases that could be treated with antibiotics that cost pennies. She swiped to another screen showing photographs of medical facilities that looked more like medieval field hospitals than anything resembling modern healthcare. The mobile unit you would lead could reach areas that fixed for all facilities never could. You'd establish temporary clinics, train local volunteers, and provide emergency medical care to people who have been forgotten by the rest of the world. Priya studied the images, her medical training automatically assessing what she was seeing. The conditions were appalling, but not hopeless. With proper equipment, medication, and trained personnel, tremendous improvements could be made in these people's lives. The question was whether she was brave enough to be the person who made those improvements happen. How long would the initial deployment last? She asked, and was surprised to realize that she was seriously considering the proposal. Margaret smiled, recognizing the shift in Priya's tone from skeptical to genuinely curious. 18 months, with the option to extend or return home based on conditions in the field and your own preferences. We never ask people to make open-ended commitments because the psychological stress would be too much. Elena shifted the baby to her other arm and looked directly at Priya. I know we're asking you to leave everything familiar and safe, to take risks that most people would never consider. But I also know that you're the kind of person who runs toward emergencies instead of away from them. Last night proved that you have the courage and the skills, and we have the resources and the support systems to make it possible. The security officer who had remained silent throughout the conversation finally spoke up, his voice professional but kind. Ms. Sethi, I've worked in South Sudan for 3 years, and I want you to know that while the risks are real, they're manageable with proper precautions and training. Our security protocols are the result of lessons learned from dozens of similar operations, and our evacuation procedures have been tested under actual emergency conditions. David returned to his chair and pulled out a folder filled with documents. We're not asking you to decide today, but we are asking you to seriously consider it. These are the training curricula, deployment protocols, compensation packages, and emergency support systems that would be available to you. Take time to read through everything, talk to people you trust, and give us your answer within 2 weeks. Priya accepted the folder, feeling the weight of both the documents and the decision they represented. Inside were detailed descriptions of medical training programs that sounded more comprehensive than some residency programs, security briefings that read like military intelligence reports, and testimonials from healthcare workers who had completed similar deployments. The scope and professionalism of the operation was impressive, but also intimidating. There's one more thing, Elena said as the group prepared to leave. She reached into the baby carrier and pulled out a small, hand-carved wooden figurine. This was made by a refugee artist in the camp where we lost our Seber son. She gave it to us as a thank you for the small amount of medical supplies we were able to provide. I've carried it ever since, as a reminder of why we do this work. She placed the figurine in Priya's hands, and she could see that it was carved in the shape of a woman holding a child, the wood worn smooth from years of handling. I want you to have it while you make your decision. Not as pressure, but as a connection to the people whose lives could be changed by your choice. The helicopter departure was as dramatic as the arrival had been. The powerful rotors creating a windstorm that sent leaves and debris swirling across Priya's yard before the aircraft rose into the sky and disappeared toward the horizon. Priya stood in her doorway long after the sound had faded, holding the wooden figurine and the folder full of life-changing possibilities. Over the following days, she found herself unable to focus on routine activities. Her shifts at Mercy General felt mundane compared to the prospect of providing emergency medical care in one of the world's most challenging AXA environments. She researched South Sudan extensively, reading news reports, academic papers, and first-hand accounts from aid workers. The picture that emerged was complex, a country struggling with poverty, conflict, and natural disasters, but also filled with resilient people who deserved access to basic health care. She called her parents to discuss the opportunity, and their reaction surprised her. Instead of expressing concern about the risks involved, they reminded her of the young girl who had insisted on becoming a nurse so she could help people who had no one else to help them. "We didn't raise you to play it safe, Priya," her father said. "We raised you to make a difference." Her colleagues at the hospital were more mixed in their responses. Some expressed admiration for her courage and idealism, while others questioned whether she was throwing away a stable career for an impossible mission. Dr. Harrison, the emergency department chief who had been her mentor for years, surprised her by revealing that he had considered similar opportunities earlier in his career, but had ultimately decided the risks were too high. "I've always regretted not taking that chance," he told her during a quiet moment between patient cases. "Not because I haven't had a fulfilling career here, but because I've always wondered what I might have accomplished if I'd been brave enough to try. Don't let fear make that decision for you." The training materials Margaret had provided were both comprehensive and sobering. The medical curriculum covered everything from battlefield surgery to tropical disease management, while the security training included protocols for operating in active conflict zones and procedures for emergency evacuation. The psychological preparation modules addressed the mental health challenges that came with working in high-stress, high-risk environments where failure could mean death for the people depending on you. 10 days after the helicopter visit, Priya made her decision. She called Margaret Chen's direct number and heard the smile in the woman's voice when she said, "I accept the position." The conversation that followed was businesslike and efficient, covering logistics for ending her current employment, beginning the training program, and preparing for what would be the greatest challenge of her professional life. Her last shift at Mercy General was emotionally charged, filled with colleagues who wanted to express their admiration, concern, and in some cases, their belief that she was making a terrible mistake. Priya found herself thinking about the night she had delivered Elena's baby, how everything had felt surreal and impossible until it was happening, and then it had simply been work that needed to be done. The training facility in Virginia was unlike anything she had expected, a complex that resembled a cross between a medical school and a military base. Her fellow trainees included doctors, nurses, and medics from around the world, all preparing for deployments in challenging environments. The diversity of backgrounds and experiences was inspiring, and Priya quickly realized that she was surrounded by people who shared her commitment to serving others, regardless of the personal cost. The medical training was intensive and practical, focused on procedures and treatments that could be performed with limited equipment in austere conditions. She learned to perform surgery using battery-powered instruments, to diagnose diseases based on clinical observation rather than laboratory tests, and to improvise medical solutions using whatever materials were available. The instructors were all veterans of field medicine who understood that theoretical knowledge meant nothing if it couldn't be applied under pressure. The security training was equally rigorous, covering everything from situational awareness to emergency communication protocols. She learned to recognize signs of potential violence, to navigate checkpoints controlled by armed militias, and to make rapid decisions about when to evacuate versus when to continue providing medical care, despite danger. The psychological aspects of this training were perhaps the most challenging, forcing her to confront her own fears and limitations. 3 months later, Priya found herself on a transport plane heading for Juba, the capital of South Sudan, equipped with skills and knowledge she had never imagined possessing. Her team included 2 experienced medics, a logistics coordinator, and 2 security specialists, all of whom had worked in similar environments before. The mobile medical unit itself was a marvel of engineering, a collection of vehicles and equipment that could establish a functional clinic anywhere within hours. The first refugee camp they visited was home to over 30,000 people who had fled violence in other parts of the country. The conditions were exactly as devastating as the photographs had suggested, But what the images hadn't captured was the resilience and dignity of the people living there. Children played games with improvised toys while their parents worked to create some semblance of normal life amid the chaos and uncertainty. Priya's first patient was a woman who had walked for days while in labor, arriving at the camp just as her contractions became overwhelming. As Priya knelt beside her in the makeshift medical tent, using skills learned during months of intensive training, she found herself thinking about that stormy night on the rooftop when she had caught Elena's daughter in her hands. The circumstances were vastly different, but the fundamental challenge was the same: bringing life safely into the world when everything seemed to be working against that possibility. The birth went smoothly, and as Priya placed the healthy baby boy in his mother's arms, she felt the same rush of purpose and accomplishment that had driven her to accept this impossible mission. Around her, the mobile clinic buzzed with activity as her team treated dozens of other patients, each case representing a life that might have been lost without their presence. Over the following months, Priya and her team established temporary clinics in remote areas that had never seen professional medical care. They treated everything from malaria and malnutrition to war wounds and complications from female genital mutilation. Each day brought new challenges that tested every aspect of their training, but also new opportunities to make a tangible difference in people's lives. The work was exactly as difficult and dangerous as Margaret and David had warned, but it was also more rewarding than anything Priya had ever experienced. She was using her skills at their highest level, making decisions that directly impacted whether people lived or died, and seeing the immediate results of her efforts in the form of recovered patients and grateful families. 6 months into her deployment, Priya received a satellite communication from Elena, who was calling from her home in the United States. The baby she had delivered during the flood was now walking and had begun to say her first words. Elena wanted Priya to know that her daughter's middle name was Priya, chosen to honor the woman who had brought her safely into the world. "She's beautiful and healthy and curious about everything," Elena said through the crackling connection. "And every day when I look at her, I'm reminded that there are children all over the world who deserve the same chance at life that you gave her. Thank you for taking this risk, for accepting this challenge, for being exactly who you are." As Priya ended the call and returned to her work in the clinic, she reflected on the chain of events that had brought her to this place. A storm, a rooftop, a moment of crisis that had revealed her true capabilities and connected her with people who could help her use those capabilities on a scale she had never imagined. The wooden figurine Elena had given her sat on her small desk, a reminder of the artist who had created it and the countless other refugees whose lives could be changed by the presence of skilled, committed healthcare providers. The sun was setting over the refugee camp, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples that seemed almost impossibly beautiful, given the harsh realities of life below. Children's voices carried on the evening air as families gathered around cooking fires, sharing what little they had and finding moments of joy despite their circumstances. Tomorrow would bring new medical emergencies, new challenges, and new opportunities to save lives, but tonight there was a sense of peace and purpose that made every risk worthwhile. Priya had learned that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite it. She had discovered that her skills as a nurse could extend far beyond anything she had previously imagined, and that the most rewarding work often came with the highest stakes and the greatest challenges. Most importantly, she had found her place in a global network of people committed to the radical idea that every human life had value, regardless of circumstances or geography. The mobile clinic would move on to the next location in a few days, carrying hope and healing to people who had been forgotten by much of the world. And Priya would be there, ready to catch the next baby born into impossible circumstances, to treat the next patient who needed someone to refuse to give up on them, to be exactly what she had always been, a nurse who ran toward emergencies instead of away from them. The floodwaters had receded long ago, but the current they had set in motion continued to carry her toward places and possibilities she was only beginning to understand. 9 months into her deployment, Priya faced her greatest challenge yet when fighting erupted between government forces and rebel groups in the region where her team was operating. The camp they were serving had swelled to over 50,000 refugees, creating conditions that strained every resource and tested every protocol they had learned. The sound of gunfire had become a constant backdrop to their medical work, growing closer each day as the conflict intensified around them. The evacuation order came on a Tuesday morning while Priya was performing emergency surgery on a teenage boy who had stepped on a landmine. Her hands never paused in their careful work of saving his leg, even as Marcus, her security chief, briefed her on the rapidly deteriorating situation outside the medical tent. 3 other aid organizations had already pulled out, and the UN peacekeeping force was preparing to withdraw from the area within hours. "We have a helicopter standing by," Marcus said quietly, his eyes constantly scanning the tent entrance for potential threats. "But if we're going to leave, it has to be now. The airspace won't be secure much longer." Priya looked down at the boy on her operating table, his eyes wide with pain and fear, depending entirely on her skill to determine whether he would walk again. Around the tent, dozens of other patients waited for treatment, including 3 women in various stages of labor and an elderly man whose infected wound needed immediate attention. "How long do we have?" she asked, her voice steady despite the weight of the decision she faced. Marcus checked his radio and conferred briefly with his team before answering. 30 minutes, maybe less. The rebels are moving faster than intelligence predicted, and if we're still here when they arrive, extraction becomes exponentially more dangerous." The boy on the table gripped Priya's arm weakly, and though he spoke no English, his expression clearly communicated his understanding that his fate hung in the balance of conversations he couldn't comprehend. The decision that followed would define not just Priya's career, but her understanding of what it meant to truly serve others. She looked around the medical tent at the faces of people who had nowhere else to go, no other source of hope for survival, and realized that evacuating now would mean abandoning them to face their medical emergencies alone. "I'm staying," she announced, surprising even herself with the firmness of her resolve. "Anyone who wants to leave should go now, but I can't walk away from these patients." Marcus's expression shifted from professional concern to something closer to admiration mixed with frustration. "Priya, I understand the impulse, but my job is to keep you alive, and staying here makes that impossible." 2 of her medical team members chose to evacuate, gathering their personal belongings and preparing to board the helicopter that circled overhead. But Dr. James Okafor, a surgeon from Nigeria who had joined the team 3 months earlier, surprised everyone by announcing his intention to stay as well. "I didn't come here to run when things got difficult," James said, already preparing instruments for the next surgery. "These people need us more now than they ever have." The logistics coordinator and 1 security specialist also chose to remain, creating a skeleton crew that would have to handle medical emergencies for 50,000 refugees with minimal support and no clear evacuation plan. The helicopter departed with the other team members and most of their non-essential equipment, leaving behind a group of medical professionals who had made the conscious choice to risk everything for people they barely knew. As the aircraft disappeared into the distance, Priya felt a mixture of terror and exhilaration that reminded her of wading through floodwater toward a rooftop where strangers needed her help. The next 72 hours tested every aspect of their training and pushed them far beyond what anyone had imagined possible. The camp's population continued to grow as people fled the advancing conflict, while medical supplies dwindled and the security situation deteriorated by the hour. Priya found herself performing procedures she had only read about, using improvised equipment, and making life-or-death decisions with limited information and no possibility of consultation with specialists. The most challenging case came on the 2nd night when a woman arrived at the clinic, having been shot in the abdomen while protecting her children from crossfire. The bullet had caused internal bleeding that required immediate surgery, but their surgical supplies were nearly exhausted, and the generator powering their equipment was running low on fuel. Working by the light of solar-powered medical lamps, Priya and James operated for 6 hours to save the woman's life. Their hands steadied despite the sound of combat growing ever closer. During the operation, Priya found herself thinking about Elena's daughter, now taking her first steps in the safety of her parents' home, and about all the children in this camp who might never have that opportunity if she and her team failed in their mission. The responsibility was overwhelming, but it was also clarifying. stripping away every consideration except the fundamental obligation to preserve life, when and where possible. The woman survived the surgery and recovered enough to be reunited with her children, who had waited outside the medical tent throughout the long night. When Priya finally emerged from the surgical area, exhausted and covered in blood, but victorious, she found the entire remaining population of the camp waiting quietly outside, their faces reflecting a mixture of gratitude and hope that made every risk worthwhile. Communication with the outside world had been sporadic, but on the third day, Priya's satellite phone crackled to life with a call from Margaret Chen. The relief in Margaret's voice was palpable when Priya answered, confirming that she and her team were still alive and continuing to provide medical care despite the deteriorating conditions. "The whole organization has been holding its breath," Margaret said. "David and Elena have been coordinating with government officials and military commanders to arrange emergency extraction." What followed was a conversation that revealed the full extent of the international attention their situation had attracted. News organizations around the world were reporting on the medical team that had chosen to stay behind with refugees, while other aid workers evacuated. And their story had captured public imagination in a way that was both inspiring and concerning. Politicians and humanitarian leaders were calling for military intervention to ensure their safety, while others argued that their decision to stay had been reckless and endangered the entire operation. "We're working on multiple extraction scenarios," Margaret explained, "but the most realistic option involves a joint operation between UN peacekeepers and local government forces to establish a secure corridor out of the area. It's complicated by the fact that both sides of the conflict are claiming you're providing aid to their enemies, which makes you targets for everyone involved." Priya listened to the political complexities, while simultaneously examining a child with severe malnutrition, her medical training allowing her to process multiple streams of critical information simultaneously. The reality was that extraction had become secondary to the immediate medical needs surrounding her, and she found herself oddly calm about circumstances that should have been terrifying. "Margaret," she said finally, "I appreciate everything you're doing to get us out of here safely, but I need you to understand that we can't leave until we're certain these people have other medical support available. There are women who will give birth in the next few days, children who need ongoing treatment for malnutrition, and surgical patients who require postoperative care. Walking away now would mean abandoning them to die." The silence that followed was long enough for Priya to wonder if the connection had been lost, but finally Margaret's voice returned, filled with something that sounded like wonder. "Priya, do you realize what you're saying? You're willing to risk your life and the lives of your team members to continue providing medical care to people you met less than a year ago, in a situation where trained soldiers are reluctant to operate." The question forced Priya to examine her own motivations, and what she discovered surprised her with its clarity. "I became a nurse because I wanted to help people who had no one else to help them," she said. "These refugees are the ultimate expression of that calling. They have no government to protect them, no insurance to pay for their health care, no family members with resources to advocate for them. If we don't help them, literally no one will." The extraction finally came 5 days later, in the form of a joint humanitarian convoy that included UN peacekeepers, government soldiers, and vehicles from multiple aid organizations. The operation required careful coordination with all sides of the conflict, and even then, it was touch and go as the convoy made its way through territory that changed hands multiple times during their journey to safety. As Priya watched the refugee camp disappear behind them, she felt a profound sense of loss, mixed with the relief of survival. They had saved hundreds of lives during those 5 critical days, but they were also leaving behind thousands of people who still needed medical care. The mobile clinic would return when security conditions improved, but for now, these vulnerable populations would have to rely on whatever basic care the remaining aid workers could provide. The debriefing process took place at the IHF headquarters in Nairobi, where Priya and her team spent 2 weeks being evaluated by medical professionals, security experts, and psychologists who specialized in treating humanitarian workers who had experienced trauma. The physical examination revealed that she had lost 15 pounds during the deployment and showed signs of chronic stress, but her mental health assessment surprised everyone by indicating remarkable resilience and Clarity of purpose. Dr. Patricia and Becky, the staff psychologist, seemed particularly intrigued by Priya's psychological profile during their final session. Most people who experience what you've been through show significant signs of post-traumatic stress, depression, or anxiety, she said. Instead, you seem to have found a level of professional satisfaction and personal fulfillment that's quite extraordinary. Can you help me understand how that's possible? Priya had spent considerable time during the debriefing process reflecting on exactly that question, and her answer had become clearer with each conversation. I think it's because I finally found work that uses every aspect of who I am, she said. My medical training, my ability to work under pressure, my willingness to take risks for other people, even my stubborn refusal to give up when situations seem impossible. For the first time in my career, I feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be, doing exactly what I'm meant to do. The recommendation from the psychological evaluation was that Priya be offered an extended leave to rest and recover, followed by the option to return to fieldwork if she chose. Instead, she requested immediate reassignment to another challenging deployment, arguing that the skills she had developed and the relationships she had built with refugee populations made her more valuable in the field than sitting behind a desk processing her experiences. Margaret Chen called her into a private meeting to discuss what had become known within the organization as the Priya Protocol, a new approach to humanitarian medical deployment that emphasized longer-term commitment to specific populations rather than rotating teams through different crisis zones. What you accomplished in South Sudan has changed how we think about field medicine, Margaret explained. The relationships you built with the refugee community, the trust you established, the cultural competency you developed, all of it suggests that our traditional model of short-term deployments might be less effective than we thought. The proposal that emerged from that conversation was both exciting and daunting. Priya would lead a new kind of humanitarian medical program that focused on establishing long-term presence in refugee communities, building local healthcare capacity while providing ongoing emergency medical care. Instead of the traditional 18-month deployment cycle, she would commit to 3 years in a single location, with the goal of creating sustainable healthcare systems that could continue operating even when international teams eventually departed. Elena called while Priya was reviewing the proposal documents, and the conversation that followed helped crystallize her decision. Belena's daughter was now talking in complete sentences and had begun showing interest in her mother's work with the Humanitarian Foundation. She asks about the nurse lady who helped her be born, Elena said with a laugh. I think she's going to grow up wanting to help people just like you do. The idea that her work might inspire the next generation of humanitarian workers was both humbling and motivating, but what really convinced Priya to accept the new assignment was Elena's description of the Foundation's expanding operations. We're establishing permanent medical facilities in 12 refugee-hosting countries, Elena explained. Real hospitals, with real equipment, staffed by people like you, who are committed to staying long enough to make a genuine difference. It's the kind of systematic change that we dreamed about when we started this foundation. 3 months later, Priya found herself on another transport aircraft, this time heading for a refugee camp in northern Uganda that would be her home for the next 3 years. Her team included not just medical professionals and security personnel, but also engineers, teachers, and community development specialists who would work together to build something approaching a normal town for people who had been displaced by conflict and persecution. The scope of the project was unlike anything that had been attempted before in humanitarian work, and Priya's role extended far beyond providing medical care to include training local healthcare workers, establishing supply chains for medications and equipment, and advocating with government officials for resources and support. It was exactly the kind of complex, long-term challenge that seemed impossible until someone actually began doing the work. Her first patient in Uganda was a woman who had been walking for 3 weeks to reach the camp, carrying a sick infant and leading 2 other children through dangerous territory, where armed groups regularly attacked travelers. The baby was severely malnourished and dehydrated, requiring immediate intervention to prevent organ failure. But what struck Priya most was the mother's expression of cautious hope when she realized that medical care was available. "Is it true that you will stay?" the woman asked through a translator, her eyes reflecting the wariness of someone who had been disappointed too many times by promises of help that never materialized. Priya looked around the medical facility that would be her professional home for the next 3 years, at the equipment and supplies that represented unprecedented investment in refugee healthcare, and at the team of committed professionals who had chosen to make the same long-term commitment she had made. "Yes," she said simply. "We will stay until you don't need us anymore." The woman's smile transformed her exhausted face, and as Priya began the careful work of rehydrating the infant, she felt the same sense of purpose and possibility that had driven her to wade through floodwater toward a rooftop where strangers needed help. The work was different, the scale was larger, and the time frame was longer, but the fundamental challenge remained the same: refusing to let circumstances prevent her from saving lives. 6 months into the Uganda deployment, Priya received a package from Elena that contained photographs of her daughter playing doctor with stuffed animals, carefully bandaging their imaginary wounds, and explaining to anyone who would listen that she was helping people feel better. Included with the photos was a letter describing the Foundation's latest initiatives, including a scholarship program that would send refugee children to medical school and a research project documenting the long-term health outcomes in communities where permanent medical facilities had been established. But the most meaningful item in the package was a second wooden figurine, this one carved by an artist in the Uganda camp and depicting a woman teaching a child to care for others. The note attached explained that the artist was a former patient whose infected wound Priya had treated during her first week in the camp, and who had created the piece as a way of expressing gratitude for care that had saved not just her life, but her ability to continue caring for her own children. As Priya placed the new figurine next to the original one Elena had given her, she reflected on the journey that had brought her from a small-town nurse responding to local emergencies to a leader in global humanitarian healthcare. The path had been unpredictable and often dangerous, but it had also been profoundly meaningful in ways she was still discovering. The mobile medical unit that had started as an experiment in emergency response had evolved into a model for sustainable healthcare delivery in refugee communities around the world. Other humanitarian organizations were adopting similar approaches, and medical schools were beginning to offer specialized training programs for students interested in long-term deployment in challenging PA environments. What had begun as one nurse's response to a medical emergency during a flood was becoming a movement that could reshape how the international community addressed healthcare needs in crisis situations. 2 years into the Uganda deployment, Priya was invited to address the World Health Assembly in Geneva, where she spoke about the transformative potential of long-term commitment to vulnerable populations. Standing before an audience of health ministers, humanitarian leaders, and medical professionals from around the world, she found herself thinking about that stormy night when she had delivered Elena's baby on a rooftop, never imagining that the moment would lead to opportunities she couldn't have conceived. "Healthcare is fundamentally about relationships," she told the assembly. "The trust between patient and provider, the knowledge that comes from understanding a community's specific needs, the cultural competency that develops through sustained engagement. None of these things can be achieved through short-term interventions, no matter how well-intentioned or well-funded they might be." The speech was widely reported and led to invitations to consult with governments and organizations around the world, but Priya declined most of them in favor of returning to Uganda and the medical work that remained her primary passion. The camp had grown into something resembling a permanent settlement, with schools, markets, and even small businesses operated by refugees who were building new lives while waiting for the opportunity to return being home safely. The healthcare facility she had helped establish was now training its own nurses and midwives, creating a sustainable source of medical care that would continue operating long after the international team eventually departed. Some of her former patients had become healthcare workers themselves, and watching them provide care to new arrivals was perhaps the most rewarding aspect of her work. As her 3-year commitment neared its end, Priya faced another decision that would shape the next phase of her career in life. The Foundation was offering her a leadership position that would involve overseeing similar projects in multiple countries, essentially becoming the architect of a new approach to humanitarian healthcare on a global scale. It was an opportunity to multiply her impact exponentially, but it would also mean leaving direct patient care behind in favor of administration and policy development. The decision process was complicated by a development she hadn't anticipated. She had fallen in love with Dr. James Okafor, the surgeon who had chosen to stay with her during the crisis in South Sudan and who had become her closest colleague and confidant during the Uganda deployment. Their relationship had grown slowly and carefully, built on shared experiences and mutual respect, but it added personal considerations to what had previously been purely professional decisions. James faced his own career crossroads, having been offered a position developing trauma surgery programs in conflict zones around the world. They spent long evenings discussing their options, weighing personal happiness against professional obligations, trying to find a path that would honor both their commitment to humanitarian work and their growing commitment to each other. The solution they eventually chose surprised everyone, including themselves. Instead of accepting the Foundation's offer of a leadership position, Priya proposed creating a new kind of humanitarian medical program that would combine the systematic approach of large organizations with the flexibility and responsiveness of smaller teams. She and James would co-lead mobile medical units that could respond rapidly to emerging crises, while also providing ongoing support to established programs like the one in Uganda. The proposal required extensive negotiation and creative funding arrangements, but it ultimately resulted in the creation of the Rapid Response Medical Initiative, a partnership between multiple humanitarian organizations that could deploy experienced teams to crisis zones within hours rather than weeks. Priya's experience in South Sudan and Uganda made her uniquely qualified to lead such an operation, while James's surgical expertise provided the medical breadth necessary for addressing diverse emergency situations. Their first deployment as co-leaders came when an earthquake devastated a remote region of Nepal, creating medical emergencies in communities that were already isolated and underserved. Flying into Kathmandu with a team of hand-picked medical professionals and enough equipment to establish multiple field hospitals, Priya felt a familiar mixture of anticipation and determination that had driven her to accept every challenge in her humanitarian career. The work in Nepal was different from her previous deployments, requiring rapid adaptation to mountain conditions, different cultural contexts, and medical challenges related to crush injuries and brow infrastructure collapse. But the fundamental mission remained the same: providing skilled medical care to people who needed it most, regardless of the circumstances or the personal risks involved. Standing in a field hospital established in the shadow of the Himalayas, treating earthquake victims while snow fell outside the medical tent, Priya reflected on the journey that had brought her from delivering a baby during a flood to leading international emergency medical response operations. The wooden figurines that traveled with her to every deployment served as reminders of the connections between all her work, the common thread of bringing hope and healing to people facing their darkest moments. James appeared beside her as she finished treating a young girl whose leg had been crushed in the earthquake, but who would walk again, thanks to the surgical intervention they had been able to provide. "Thinking about the flood again?" he asked, recognizing the expression she wore when contemplating the path that had led them to this moment. Priya nodded, remembering the weight of Elena's newborn daughter in her hands and the decision to wade through dangerous water toward people who needed help. "Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't answered that emergency call," she said. "If I'd just gone home that night instead of driving toward the flood." James smiled and gestured around the bustling field hospital, where their team was working to save lives amid conditions that most people would consider impossible. "I think you would have found another emergency to answer," he said. "That's who you are, and that's why we're here." The earthquake response lasted 6 months, during which their team treated over 8,000 patients and established permanent medical facilities in 3 remote communities that had never had access to professional BA healthcare. When they finally departed Nepal, they left behind not just improved health outcomes, but also trained local medical workers who could continue providing care and a network of supply chains that would ensure ongoing access to medications and equipment. As their aircraft lifted off from Kathmandu Airport, heading for their next assignment in a refugee crisis in Central Africa, Priya watched the mountains disappear below and thought about Elena's daughter, now old enough to attend school and still expressing interest in becoming a doctor so she could help people feel better. The cycle was continuing, each act of service inspiring others to serve, each life saved creating the possibility for future acts of healing and hope. The floodwaters that had first carried Priya toward her destiny had long since receded, but their influence continued to ripple outward in ways that touched lives across continents. From a rooftop in a small American town, to refugee camps in Africa, to earthquake zones in Asia. The current had carried her toward exactly the life she was meant to live, a life dedicated to the radical idea that every human being deserved access to skilled, compassionate medical care, regardless of geography, politics, or circumstances. The next crisis was already waiting, the next opportunity to wade through metaphorical floodwaters toward people who needed someone brave enough to refuse to give up on them. And Priya would be there, ready to answer the call, carrying with her the wooden figurines that reminded her why she had chosen this path, and the knowledge that her work was part of something larger than any individual emergency or deployment. A global movement toward a world where no one faced medical crises